Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Overseas Press Club, and Chad, who's behind the screen here making everything work. Um, Let me tell you a few things about Elizabeth Becker. Most people work their way up to being a war correspondent. Elizabeth Becker just decided to go straight to the top. And that was one reason was because she was doing graduate studies in South Asia or about South Asia. You can read in the book what happened to that, but it sort of fell apart. And from there, Elizabeth, on what I would say is more than a whim, but less than a really well thought out career plan, Elizabeth bought a one-way ticket to Cambodia. And she got there in January of 1973. 4 months later, she was a contract stringer for the Washington Post, Newsweek magazine, and NBC radio. That sounds really impressive, except that it turns out there really wasn't much competition for those jobs. And the reason was, if you were a heavy hitter journalist, meaning a guy, in 1973 and covering the war, you were in Saigon. So the Washington Post Saigon bureau chief, who's not named in the book, hired Elizabeth to cover Cambodia because she was living there full time, but noted that she was the only person in the country at that time who was, quote, vaguely qualified for the job. I don't know if that's what he actually said, but anyway, that's the quote in the book. And I thought that'd be a great resume line. I was vaguely qualified for the job, especially because Elizabeth took that little opening and, slammed the door open and built a career, quite a career. I met her almost 2 decades later. She'd become a book author. She was named the senior foreign editor at NPR, which had a growing international staff that was becoming very important, and as important as the New York Times and Washington Post and everyone else who was so well known for covering international affairs. She left NPR and went to the New York Times, where she covered national security and foreign policy. Then she went on to write a book about the travel industry, and more recently has gone back to her career roots in Southeast Asia to research these 3 female correspondents who arrived there actually several years before Elizabeth, and who really helped pave the way for not just Elizabeth Becker, but for all of the women correspondents since then who have been able to cover this topic or this beat that was once forbidden to women. So Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about the women you've written about.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Patty, for inviting me. Thank you, Overseas Press Club and Chad behind the scenes. It's wonderful to be able to tell this story because, as I write, the women's story was buried. One of the reasons it was buried was that, in fact, in that era, women were not considered qualified to do anything but be a foreign was not qualified to be a foreign correspondent. If I could see the book cover, please. Here they are. At the top is Catherine Leroy, the middle is Frances FitzGerald, and at the bottom is Kate Webb. Now, they came in 1966. Now, let me just tell you what it was like for women in journalism. Most of the women were in women's sections. Women were not considered fit to cover sports, much less be sent overseas. Women were not staff foreign correspondents. The very rare exception proved the rule. And what did they go to when they got, so they had to pay their own way, they had no jobs, few connections. And the climate they entered was probably the most masculine that you could possibly go to. And I'm just going to tell you read a little bit from Peter Arnett, the Pulitzer Prize winning correspondent, who said, "The Vietnam press corps was a male bastion that women entered only at the risk of being humiliated and patronized. The prevailing view was that the war was being fought by men against men, and women had no place there. They didn't belong there. So next, please. Kate Webb. All three women had completely different backgrounds from the other. They came from 3 continents. Kate, Australian. She had a philosophy degree, was attending art school, became a temporary news copy girl in order to make some money. And in the process, in a Sydney newspaper called The Mirror. She went on to to Vietnam, where she became an extraordinary combat reporter. She then was assigned to Cambodia, where she became, as far as I can tell, the first woman bureau chief in a war zone. This was for United Press International. Certainly in the Vietnam War, and certainly there was no women even in combat, covering combat in World War II. And there is a prestigious award named in her honor, the Kate Webb Prize for the best Asian journalist. Next, please. Frances FitzGerald, the one American, a woman with great privilege, wealth, very smart, honors graduate of Radcliffe, but she was a woman, and Newsweek told her she was only qualified to be a researcher, not a writer. She went to Vietnam, took advantage of her outsider status, and recreated how to cover a war. She did not focus so entirely on the battles, but what the war was doing to the country, the people, and the culture. Her reporting led to a book, Fire in the Lake, that swept the field, changed the way Americans at least saw the war, won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Bancroft Award, the most honored book of the war. Next, please. And Catherine Leroy. You can tell that this Parisian was barely 5 feet tall. She went to Saigon the same time as Frances, known as Frankie FitzGerald. She was an accomplished pianist, a high school dropout, with no experience whatsoever of being a photographer. She had a new style of photography. She worked twice as hard as the men, put up with a lot, and ended up with a modern new look of photography that led to her winning as the first woman to win the George Polk Award and the Robert Capa Gold Medal Award. Any man would have been proud to have that. The fact that she was the first woman to do it is amazing. Next, please. Here she is. She was also a trained parachutist. And at first the men thought, oh, isn't this cute, this woman? She's a parachutist, she's small, she's tiny. She'll stay in Saigon for a few adventures, and then she'll be on her way. She didn't. In fact, she figured out how to get exclusives that they didn't even imagine. One was to convince the Americans that she was the right photojournalist to go on the first airborne assault in Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne Division. She jumped. Next, please. And took gorgeous photographs. This looks like a work of art almost. It turned out to be not only the first airborne assault, but the last. And her pictures are clearly historic. This is an aerial view, but she also pioneered a look that she called going for the eyes, an intimate, looking at war through an intimate lens rather than heroic. Next, please. I hope you can see what this means. Here she is. She took the photograph of these soldiers. She covered them in the battle, but then the shot that she really worked on was this one, where they're carrying their wounded comrade who would die. You can see on their faces the wear and tear, the anguish of the war. And that's what sort of set her apart and made it a precursor for which her photographs became famous and why she won the award. Next, please. This is one of, you see the Vietnamese woman, a look you rarely see, a villager looking at a soldier, not sure, picking up debris from a battle, a little horrified, a little scared, a photograph that stood out. Next, please. Now, the reason she could do this was because there was one photographic editor who had the radical idea that he would buy for AP any photograph that was good, even if it was taken by a woman. That sounds normal here in 2021, but that had never been before. And his name is Horst Voss. He was the photo chief of Associated Press. He himself was a Pulitzer Prize photographer, and he turned AP into the best photo agency. And thanks to him, Katrine and the women who followed her were able to break through in, now, as you know, many, many women war photographers are in the field recognized. Next, please. Frances FitzGerald. Now, she should have been the one who could have fit in easily. Her father was number 3 in the CIA. She had connections, and everyone presumed she would just float in, use her connections, be sort of a dabbling in journalism, something like a dilettante. Nothing could be more the opposite. She used her outsider status to come up with a very different way of looking at the war. Some of the examples are, after a battle, instead of going directly to Saigon to write it up, she went to the civilian hospital nearby and saw how dreadful and odious the care for these refugees were, people who had been wounded in the battle, lost their homes, and there was no help for them. And that was part of a way she said, okay, I'm going to look at villages, I'm going to look at the broader scope, the history. And she did things like, this is 1966, which may sound normal to you, but in 1966, most of the reporters took it for granted that the US effort maybe had problems, but that it was a good effort. She was skeptical. She'd grown up around people of power, and she examined the actual basis of the policy and found a lot of faults. I think one of the last of her pieces that stands out is she did a profile of Saigon, and instead of talking about the beautiful city, the power places, all that, she concentrated on the slums. She showed how this was the new face of Saigon, that the people who were being hurt, losing their homes, had to flee to Saigon, where they were in wretched conditions, no sewer, no water, all that sort of stuff. And so she then left, went to the United States, did horrendous research, and wrote Fire in the Lake. As I said, it swept the field. She was 31 years old. New Yorker considered it so important that it was serialized in 5 parts. And they had not given that much space to original war reporting since the piece on Hiroshima by John Hershey in, right after World War II. Now, her mistake was that her book came out, her mistake, I should say, one of the problems that her old colleagues saw was that her book came out the same year as David Halberstam's Best and Brightest. And to say that the colleagues were shocked that she swept the field and David Halberstam came away empty-handed was nothing, they thought there was something wrong with this. And there was a belittlement, there was too harsh of a critique. And I think it shows up in the fact that in 2017, when Ken Burns had his big series on Vietnam for PBS, He had an addendum of the 58 most important books, history books on Vietnam. Frankie FitzGerald's Fire in the Lake was not on the list, and it was the most honored of the books. Next, please. And she was devoted. Here she is in 1973, going across to, right after the peace accords that did not bring peace, crossing over to the NLF side, right after it became open. And NLF was usually referred to in journalism as the Viet Cong. And she was there. She would go back and forth, and she was actually there at the very end. She had a rare visa to Hanoi. Next, please. Kate Webb, here she is. She arrived in '67, 500,000 American troops, 1,000 reporters, only a handful of them women. When she tried to find a job, the UPI bureau chief said, "Why would I hire a woman?" Well, she showed him in 1968 during the Tet Offensive, when she was one of the first, as a freelancer, she was one of the first to get to the US Embassy. She wrote a dispatch that is still quoted in history books, where she described the scene where the North Vietnamese had entered and killed Marine guards and were holding the embassy. She called it Butcher Shop in Eden. The dispatches were so strong that the same man finally hired her. Her timing was good because just a few months earlier, a handful of women persuaded the Pentagon not to reimpose the ban on women covering battle. As I said, historically, women were not allowed to cover battle. They would follow the nurses. That was the case in World War II, et cetera. But these women convinced the Pentagon not to. And I believe one of them is part of our audience today. So I want to say hello to Yurati Kazikas, one of the greats. She was part of the group. So Kate was able to take advantage of that. And what she did, her approach was to become one of the boys. She joined them in drinking, and she was really, really allergic to anybody saying that she believed in women's liberation. And I want to just make this a point. These women, they barely knew each other. There were no sisters in arms kind of moments. And to even mention the word women's liberation was, you're gonna get laughed at. Women's liberation was considered a crutch, something to denigrate. And only when you read her diaries and her notebooks would you realize how much she suffered from sexual harassment and things like that. Anyway, she did well. She was assigned to Phnom Penh when the United States expanded the war into Cambodia. It was the most dangerous time of the whole Vietnam War for journalists. In 4 months, as many journalists were killed in Cambodia as in the preceding 6 years in Vietnam. And one of those killed was her boss. And very quietly, next please. This is the kind of war that led to all those casualties. Boy soldiers, chaotic. Next please. One of those casualties was her boss. And without a word, a press release or anything, Kate was named the bureau chief. Kate did not want it to be pointed out that she happened to be a woman. She did not want any victory laps or anything like that, with the idea that any kind of saying she's a woman this, a woman that would be a lesser. She stayed along under her byline. Kate stayed under the radar. But she also, danger caught up with her 1 year later when she was captured by the North Vietnamese inside Cambodia. And for 23 horrendous days, she didn't know if she would come out alive. She wasn't tortured, there was no rape, but it was a wearying, difficult time. When she finally got out, she realized that she'd been declared dead, and the Kate Webb legend was born. I mean, her story was everywhere. She became a legend. Next, please. And finally, she took some joy and being the only woman. Here she is in Sydney after she'd been released and she was back home for a break. She's the first woman to crash the men's only press club in Sydney. And after that, she was a little less adamant against being called a feminist. And as Anne said, I was one of them. Next, please. 1973, here I am. So I've been witness, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I owe a debt to these women. I don't think I could have done what I did without them paying their way. I arrived late enough that I could have that kind of an appreciation. And to write the book, it was helpful that I knew the players and where to look. And my goal was to tell their full stories, to have their voices narrate like a novel through their diaries, all their hidden memoirs, to tell the excitement, the romance, the obstacles and sacrifices. But especially, not just to say that they broke the ceiling, but to say that they made their mark in history, that writing the war through their eyes and their work will show the war differently. It will put women back in the center where they belong. And it'll say something about journalism, how far we've come and how far we have to go. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. The book actually is officially published on February 23rd. And if you look in the chat, there's a link that you can go to if you want to order it in advance.